Good afternoon. I'm Wayne Krug. I'm going to be discussing civil asset forfeiture from a judicial perspective. Just as a little bit of background, civil asset forfeiture is a legal framework that enables law enforcement agencies to seize assets without criminal charges being filed against the owner of those assets. It is an interesting procedure where the asset itself is the target of the action rather than the owner. And it places the burden of proof on the owner to sue the appropriate agency in order to reclaim this property. It became widespread after the passage of the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984. This was at the height of the drug war. And this framework was specifically sold as a means of attacking the assets of organized crime, particularly drug dealers. This also led to the creation of what's known as the Equitable Sharing Program, which is a framework that allows federal law enforcement to collaborate with state and local law enforcement, where essentially state and local agencies would actually do the seizure and then kick the case up to the feds to actually prosecute the forfeiture proceedings through the court. And this practice has been controversial basically since the beginning. Some of the issues with this process, one is just the general question of whether or not it's actually effective at its stated goal, which is to take these illicit assets away from the organized criminals who are acquiring them so that they cannot use them to then defend themselves against oncoming criminal charges. There have also been accusations of various bias in its application, whether it's targeting specific disadvantaged groups or targeting people in order to pad the agency's budget. And of course, there's the issue of civil rights violations, because you've essentially created a framework where property becomes a defendant rather than the owner of the property, and you then shift the burden of proof off of a typical proceeding. So, you know, it only takes a few bad apples to misuse the framework and thus cause significant harm. So what our paper sets out to do is to fill in some of the existing literature with data from dockets. So most of the existing literature focuses on law enforcement data of one form or another, whether it's annual reports from the Department of Justice or other publicly available law enforcement data, or interviews with people who have been personally involved in some way, shape, or form with the process. We wanted to look through the docket data and see if we could identify dockets that correspond to civil asset forfeiture cases. This will provide a view of the process within the legal system, specifically looking at the aftermath of the seizures. And the dockets will cover both the actual forfeiture proceedings and suits by property owners to attempt to reclaim their property. Our paper is going to focus primarily on the former for reasons that I am about to go into, which is that we specifically focused on dockets where at least one defendant is United States currency. Is one of the easiest things to try to find. There are different ways to express United States currency depending on the preferences of the attorney actually filing the motion and what form the currency is in, but it was a fairly reliable way to find dockets that corresponded to asset forfeitures. Our dockets cover federal courts, all 50 state courts, and 922 local jurisdictions. We ended up with about 117,000 hits where we had a docket that had a target defendant. However, only about 72,000 had sufficient jurisdictional information to be useful for the analysis. The other 45,000, we knew they were some sort of state or local jurisdiction, but we could not pin it on a specific one, and so we excluded them from the statistical analysis. We also augmented this data with reports from the Federal Equitable Sharing Program for 2013 through 2016. A lot of our analysis focused specifically on 2015 because it was the best intersection of docket data coverage and coverage with these equitable sharing reports. So some of the key questions we seek to answer are, can we see any indication of bias in the application of forfeiture within the docket data. Specifically, we want to see if we can identify targeting of disadvantaged groups, increased enforcement in border states, which is something that literature has proposed, or whether targets were chosen for the amount of assets that can be obtained or the use of the assets rather than any law enforcement objectives. We also want to see what effect various legislative restrictions have had on the actual practice. Specifically, we look at the state-by-state variation in the requirements to initiate a forfeiture, the burden of proof required for the owner to sue and recover assets, and what the permissible uses for the seized assets are. Unfortunately, dockets very rarely contain demographic data, so it wasn't possible just with the docket data for us to get any insight into some of those other biases along racial, ethnic, national origin lines that some of the other literature had indicated were present in the program. Starting off just highlighting some of the key findings, this plot shows the relation of state population to total dockets filed in that state. And so most states have a very consistent correlation where the number of cases is relative to the amount of population. There are 4 outliers. Maryland is an odd case in that their overall civil caseload is significantly higher per capita than other states. We did not see evidence that the civil asset forfeiture portion was out of line considering the rest of their caseload. They just have a very high overall caseload. Arizona, Nevada, and Oklahoma are worth pointing out because they are the 3 states where law enforcement is allowed to keep 100% of the seized assets and basically go straight back into the law enforcement budget. Every other state requires some sort of asset distribution, whether it's into the state general fund or to a specific line item or some kind of split between law enforcement and general fund. But there is no significant variation between states based on either the rigor that is required of a law enforcement agency to initiate a seizure or the burden of proof put on the asset owner to recover their property. Similarly, this is just looking at the federal dockets, we see, again, a very good correlation between state population and overall forfeiture caseload. In this case, the outliers have moved back towards the mean. And what this is indicating is that the equitable sharing program does not appear to be a vehicle for state and local agencies to exploit in order to target specific groups. So we see like the states where law enforcement has more of a financial objective to conduct seizures, you're not seeing the ESP used as a vehicle to conduct more of those forfeitures. Now looking at defendant count, this is another interesting trend we saw in the data. This is showing the number of defendants on each docket. So oftentimes the money was not the only defendant on a docket. You also had usually other property, sometimes a natural person would pop up on there. And so what we see in the data at the state level is an increase in the number of single defendant dockets, which is indicating that the states are increasingly targeting individuals rather than targeting larger groups where you would expect multiple things to be seized in the same forfeiture proceeding. In contrast, the federal government shows very flat trend in the number of defendants. However, for whatever reason, the federal government has always been highly biased towards single defendant cases. Now looking at some of the value and volume trends, this plot is showing the number of seizures in 6 different value bands. So basically it's the total amount of money that was seized in the particular forfeiture, and we see that there's an acceleration of the number of small seizures that roughly correlates to that increase in the number of single defendants at the state level. However, if you look at the overall value picture, you see that it's pretty consistent over time where the different bands contribute to the total amount of seizure about the same. And you can see it's like this dip here there was a reform legislation passed in 2000 to try to rein in the practice. And so you can actually see some of those dips in the total seizure data, although it is a lagging indicator to when that legislation was passed. So the conclusions, really briefly, we are seeing an increase in the number of forfeiture cases in the dockets. However, we're not able to find conclusive evidence of bias in the case distribution, though there are some elements that are a little fishy, specifically that state trend towards more small seizures and single defendant seizures, as well as those 3 outliers being the 3 states that allow law enforcement to keep all of the assets. So in the future, we would like to try to close the gap that I mentioned earlier with the demographic data by both combining the dockets we have found with other legal data, specifically pleadings and opinions, to try to get more information about the defendants in these underlying cases and what the results of those cases were, and to try to use external sources to correlate these dockets with economic conditions, state poverty rates, state demographics, and also travel patterns. So I'd like to acknowledge my many co-authors, as well as the Bloomberg Law team, for assisting us in collecting and collating this data. And if you have any questions, we do have a poster, and you can come by later and talk to us. A few of the authors are actually here. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? Over in the corner of the room over there? Am I good? All right, cool. Good afternoon. I'm Rachel, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about our research exploring drivers of local jail incarceration rates in the U.S. Over the past 3 decades, the U.S. has seen large increases in incarceration. According to the most recent data from the Prison Policy Initiative, the U.S. incarceration rate in 2016 was 5 times higher than most countries in the world. Although there has been a slight decline in rates, as some states have adopted new policies to revise sentencing and correction laws, the fact remains that mass incarceration in the U.S. is a real and very complicated problem. There are approximately 2.3 million Americans behind bars, split between state and federal prisons, local jails, immigration detention centers, and several other different types of correctional facilities. One key distinction to make is between prisons and jails, the 2 largest pieces of the pie. Prisons house convicted criminals, which are serving long-term sentences, while jails hold people awaiting trial or those serving short sentences for minor offenses. Jail inmates make up more than 1/4 of this pie. However, not shown in any of this right here is the huge amount of churn. Over the course of an average year, 12 million people will go in and out of the local jail system due to its short-term nature. Yet much of the research conversation has focused on prisons rather than jails. As a crude metric, we can look at a recent Google Scholar search, where papers with prison in the title outnumber those with jail by a factor of 10. What's more, research is usually focused at the state level and not on counties. That's why the Vera Institute of Justice, a nonprofit dedicated to criminal justice reform, launched the Incarceration Trends Project at the end of 2015 to provide data on jail incarceration at the county level. Data show a growing urban-rural disparity in jail incarceration rates. In 2013, rates in rural areas were 40% higher than those in large urban metro areas. This is clearly striking, and it can have huge implications for understanding and addressing the mass incarceration problem in the United States, a cornerstone of the work, very important work that Vera does. However, it's not really actionable unless we understand more about what is actually driving these changes. So to explore the potential causes of this urban-rural divide, Vera partnered with the 2 Sigma Data Clinic, which is an arm of 2 Sigma that provides data science and technology support to nonprofits and government entities. Together with Vera, we divided the larger research question, which is, why are jail populations in rural counties so much higher than those in urban counties, into 2 different pieces? what are the characteristics of a county that are associated with local jail rates? And how do counties compare to their peers with similar characteristics? The measures we considered included urban code, which was 4 categories: rural, small to mid-metro, suburban metro, and urban metro. Year was treated as a categorical variable. We then calculated several different measures at the jail level, the county level, and the state level. And I know I just flew through that, but we don't have time. More of it's in the paper. Our analysis used local jail census data compiled by Vera for over 2,800 counties, plus additional secondary data sources. Although the data goes all the way back to 1970, we restricted our analysis to the past 14 years due to some missing covariate data and major changes to the census classification in race ethnicity in the 2000s. A general estimating equations approach was selected to account for the lack of independence within counties from year to year. So a county's given rate one year is definitely not independent of its year if its jail rate the next year. And lastly, considering the dependent variables account, we used a generalized linear model with a log link. In our baseline model, we explored the urban-rural divide in jail rates, but also took into account correlations within counties and any time trends. The final model included the additional variables at the jail, state, and county level. So starting from our baseline model and treating rural as a referent category, we can see that, as expected, local jail rates are higher in rural counties than in urban metro areas. For example, jail rates are approximately 35% higher in rural areas as compared to suburban metros. But once we add the model covariates, because remember the baseline model is only taking into account urban code, over half of the variation in local jail rate by urban code is explained away. Now the percentage change in jail rates comparing rural and suburban has changed from 35% to 15%. So although it matters where the county lies on this kind of urban-rural spectrum, the descriptive ability is really diminished in the presence of these additional characteristics. And this is exciting because it helps us to understand, like, what are the underlying mechanisms that's driving this urban and rural disparity. Now let's look at what those are. So here we have a plot showing the percent change in local jail rates for every 10 percentage point increase in each measure. And just a note of caution here, you can't directly compare different measures because some are rates and some are percentages. But the key takeaway here is that county level poverty has a very strong association with local jail rates. For every 10 percentage point increase in poverty, jail rates increase by over 19%. Even more incredible, we tried a truncated model that included county level data on crime and arrests, and poverty was the only significant variable. So in other words, if you want to know a county's jail rate, it's not the amount of crime being committed or the arrest rate that matters, but it's poverty. Now let's look at the second question. How do counties compare to their peers? Well, we could naively look at this by looking at any given county's jail rate and comparing it to the national average or the national mean. But as we already know, higher poverty tends to lead to higher jail rates, so we'd expect there to be differences between high and low poverty areas. What we really want to get at is whether a county has an exceptionally high or low jail rate compared to counties with similar characteristics. And we do this by calculating residuals. So that represents the difference between a county's actual jail rate and what we'd expect its jail rate to be given its measurable characteristics. As an example, let's take a look at Arizona. Here we see average local jail rates, and the general predominant color there is pink, which signifies that jail rates in Arizona are slightly higher than nationally. Now let's see what happens when we apply our model, which takes into account the measured variables that we know about. We have a complete color change here. These are residuals from our model, and Arizona is now looking much better. Now, the dark teal signifies negative residuals, so jail rates in Arizona are much lower than expected, given the addition of other variables. Arizona actually has lower jail rates than its peers. Now, you might notice that there's this one glaring county here, and it's Maricopa County, and I'm so glad that you mentioned Sheriff Joe, because here we have an example of Sheriff Joe right here. So let's look at Maricopa, which is clearly different from the rest of the state. So Maricopa has an actual jail rate of 228 per 100,000. That is only slightly higher than the national median, but given that Maricopa is urban, Phoenix is contained within Maricopa, and it has a fairly low poverty rate. Its actual rate is almost twice as high as we would expect it to be given the characteristics we know about it. So, unlike the rest of Arizona, Maricopa County's jail rate is higher than its peers. So, thanks, Sheriff Joe. Now let's take a look at the zoomed out look at the full US. Here we see clusters of higher than expected rates in Utah and Indiana, Florida, Maryland, New Jersey shore areas. But on the other side, we see clusters of lower than expected rates in Ohio, Northeast, and Oregon. So clearly this is not a randomly distributed pattern, and what this is suggesting is that there really is something exceptional influencing these clusters, jail rates in these clusters, above and beyond the characteristics we've included in our model. We also see that some of the residual clusters seem to adhere to state boundaries. So we have a divide here between Utah and Arizona, and a similar one between Indiana and Ohio. And lastly, you see Florida and Georgia, which are a pretty severe comparison to Mississippi. So, what did we learn? Well, despite differences in local jail rates by urbanicity, the inclusion of covariates in our model was able to explain away over half of that variation. We found that poverty was an important driver, even more so than crime and arrest data. We learned that clusters of high and low jail rates persisted even after the inclusion of these additional characteristics. So this is really an opportunity for a much more targeted investigation into what's driving these geographic patterns. And lastly, the influence of state-level incarceration policies clearly is important and warrants future research. So I'd like to thank my co-authors, and especially Christine Zhang, for her help in this presentation. And if anyone's interested in learning more about or collaborating with the Data Clinic, just send us an email at dataclinicinfo@2sigma.com. Thank you so much.
Oh, we decided to come over here.
Late switch, thanks. Okay, well, Miriam, you're starting, so you want to be forefront?
Sure.
Okay.
All right, hello everybody. My name is Miriam Chappelka, this is Dorris Scott, and this is Mizzani Walker-Holmes. And the work we're presenting to you today is from an internship at the Georgia Tech Data Science for Social Good in Atlanta, and in partnership with the Atlanta Community Food Bank. The Atlanta Community Food Bank has a mission of eliminating hunger in their service area by 2025. And they are trying to achieve this goal through a diverse variety of measures, and one of these is policy advocacy, specifically advocating for food stamps, or SNAP, which stands for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And they asked us to help them gauge public opinion on SNAP in order to help them present a more informed argument to politicians, and in order to better present their argument to stakeholders and community members. We did this in a variety of ways. We collected data from a variety of sources. We looked at census data to understand underlying demographics of areas depending on their perception of SNAP. We looked at voting records to understand how local Georgia politicians have voted on SNAP. And we also looked at news articles and social media data in order to do sentiment analysis and look at how people and news outlets were talking about SNAP. And then we combined these all into an interactive web app. So data collection. We got politician data from Open States, which has an API, and we specifically looked at Georgia politicians' data. And we're hoping to, in the future, look at congressional level data. And we used WebHose.io in order to scrape news articles from the internet.
All right, I guess that's me. Okay, please forgive my referencing. I want to make sure I didn't leave anything out due to nerves. Okay, so we used Facebook data to collect data as well as Twitter data. Our Facebook data was collected using Graph API, an open source tool such as FacePager. Twitter data was collected on a 1-month period using StreamR packages in R, which accesses the Twitter streaming tool, but affords a minimal amount of geocoding. The streaming API allows 1% access of Twitter tweets that are being tweeted in real time. Collecting was based on search terms such as SNAP, EBT, food stamps, etc. These tools allowed us to further diversify our tools and personify our discourse. So we used two unsupervised sentiment analysis tools, Vader and AFIN. Vader basically is a lexicon, rule-based sentiment analysis tool that's used to score based on words. And AFIN is a Python package that is used to gauge the type of tools that are being used and identify words. So each article was tokenized to the sentence level, and each sentence was given a sentiment score according to the two tools. At that point, the scores were aggregated for each of the articles with the weight that was assigned to each sentence. This aggregation was represented through the sentiment of the article. However, in order to take the account of the impact of each article, we then had to aggregate the results and in regards to the traffic of the level of the website and the reading level of the article. So in terms of the topic modeling, we thought it would be a great idea to provide information of the arguments and topics in these articles. To provide this, however, we had to provide preliminary topic modeling, or LDA, and that was performed through extracting topical words through text. The term frequency inverse was used to detect important words accessed all throughout the documents. Name entity recognition, which is from the Stanford NLP group, was used to detect key people or locations mentioned throughout the articles. Word cloud, which was generated and very helpful for our resources to our partners, was also created through the phrases and terms that we provided. These word clouds were an integral part of the deliverables that we provided. And it also allowed the viewers to understand the subject of the sentiment and to better personify the public discourse.
So based on what the food bank wanted, we created a web app, and we used the Shiny Web framework in order to do that in R. And so we have something called a Snap Info Map, which I will talk about. And we used the results of the sentiment analysis to create visualizations. And then we also created a voting record tool. So when the food bank approached us about this project, they said they wanted to know the most frequent words that were on news outlets on the state level, in conservative news outlets, and in liberal news outlets, and in national. So we decided that creating a word cloud would be the best way to show the most frequent amount of words. And the person that used this says that she uses this app in order to prepare herself when she meets with stakeholders. And another thing they wanted to know is where are the news outlets reporting about SNAP? So we created a SNAP info map, which gives you information about the sentiment scored in news article based on Vader and AFIN, the location of the news source, and the type. And clustering was used using Geddes or G star to cluster positive and negative reporting on SNAP. Also, because the whole idea of what's positive, what's negative, that can be very subjective. The way we thought to tackle this is to show trends throughout time about how SNAP is being reported. So just because something is negative doesn't mean it's negative about the SNAP program. In this case, President Trump had made a speech about the cuts on SNAP, which triggered a negative response. So we thought that creating a tool to show the results of the bigram and the NER can pretty much help the policy makers and the people at the food bank better understand that just because it's a negative tweet or a negative news article, that doesn't necessarily mean it's negative about SNAP. And also, we did it for Facebook data as well, and we based it off the VADER or AFIN.
All right, this is a look at what the website looks like when you're looking at politician voting records. You can choose the chamber and you can choose a politician. And then you can see the bills that have been related to food stamps and food insecurity in the Georgia General Assembly. And we are currently working on expanding this using the ProPublica Congress API to include federal level data.
So in conclusion, we'd like to really thank our mentor, Carl DeSalvo. He was an amazing part of why we even pursued this project, as well as our partners, Lauren Waits, Allison Young, and Jocelyn Litch. And as well as our sponsors, LexisNexis, Southbound Hub, and NSF.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Auerbach. Can you hear me? My name is Jeremy Auerbach. I was also part of the DSSG program at Georgia Tech this summer. We worked on a separate project, though. We worked with an Atlanta community organization that was interested in displacement due to urban renewal projects. So I'm just going to talk about today. I'm going to run through the methods, but we have a poster downstairs, and the paper also explains more in the methods. So as the Back to the City movement continues, there's a fear that urban renewal projects will cause displacement of low income and some of the more established residents in some of these areas. And this is also true in Atlanta. Right now, they're currently building the new Falcon Stadium on the west side of Atlanta, and there's a lot of folks that are concerned that they're gonna that their property taxes are gonna shoot up, and they're not gonna be able to afford to live in these areas anymore. These poor areas around where the stadium is being constructed. So we had a three-part project where one, we were going to estimate the number of eligible people for an anti-displacement program, the cost of the program, and eventually build a tool for advertising this program for the residents in this area. So this program, this anti-displacement program, was funded or is going to be funded by a number of private institutions such as Delta, Chick-fil-A, to try to cover some of the increased property taxes from the new stadium and some of the urban renewal projects going on the west side of Atlanta. And they had contracted an independent evaluator to estimate the program costs and the number of eligible participants. But when we first looked at how they estimated some of these, the costs and the number of eligible individuals, there were some questionable assumptions. They used a lot of aggregated data. They looked at property tax appreciation for the entire city, but that may not have been applicable to these specific areas where these programs are undergoing. So what we did was we tried to look at a more fine-scale, granular, individual household level estimate of the program. And I'll discuss a little bit about what we did. So the program eligibility, there's a number of eligibility requirements. One, the individuals have to live nearby where the stadium is going to be built. So these four neighborhoods on the west side of Atlanta, they have to not only own the house, but they also have to occupy the home. So they have to live there full time. And there's an income threshold, so they can't be making so much money to be eligible for this program. And they can't have any outstanding debts on the home, no liens, nothing like that. If they become eligible, then what the program will do, it'll fund future property tax increases. So it'll cover anything that increases in the next 20 years due to the stadium. So the original estimate had something about 400 or so folks. We reran the estimates at individual level using some of the tax data from the Fulton County in Atlanta. And we also got access to a liens database. So we were able to find out folks that had liens on their properties. And what we did for income, to get an individual household level income, we used some machine learning techniques, first by looking at relationships between rent and income and housing characteristics from the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which the census does every single year. But they only sample a very small portion of the population. So what we did was we used several years for Atlanta, and we tried to estimate the relationship between rent and income and housing characteristics such as number of rooms, the size of the house, the location of the home, etc. And then we're able to use Zillow rent estimates for all of the homes in the West Side to generate some sort of income estimate for each house and satisfy the eligibility requirement. So we were able to come up with 442 homes, a little bit higher than what the original estimate was. Next major part of the project in terms of methodology was trying to forecast home appreciation. So like I said, the original program estimates were built on a very aggregated entire city of Atlanta, which was like something like 12%. He looked at like the last 10 years, and it was like a 12% growth, right? But these areas have a little bit, I mean, these are low-income areas. They may not follow this 12%. So how are we going to be able to estimate what the home appreciation was going to be for these 4 neighborhoods? Well, so there's another urban renewal project going on all around the city of Atlanta called the Beltline. I'm not sure if anybody here has heard of it. It was an old rail line that encircled the city, and it hasn't been used in years. And so what the city is doing is they're converting it into a multi-use trail. So people can they can run, they can jog, they can walk their kids, dogs, they can ride bikes on this trail. And part of it has already been constructed on the east side in the last 10 years. A lot of new shops have opened up nearby, bars, restaurants, condos have been popping up all over. It's very attractive. But the east side was also somewhat of a low-income area before this Beltline, but now it's almost a high-income area. So what we did was we used that as a proxy. So this old Fourth Ward area, this is the Beltline that's already constructed. What we did was we looked at the home values for the last 10 years for Old Fourth Ward, which coincides exactly when the Beltline was constructed in 2006 on the east side by the Old Fourth Ward. What we did is we used random forests, and we were able to cluster based on housing characteristics what the home appreciation trends would be. So we get these four clusters here. Then what we did was we looked on the west side where where the stadium is going to be built, and we fit all of those housing characteristics to those clusters for the west side. So then we're able to get home appreciation values for these homes on the west side. So the original cost estimate for 7 years for the program would have been $500,000. With our individual level household data and estimates, we get almost $2 million. And we also get more individuals should be eligible for the program. We ran several different models, different simulations, but just comparing with the original estimate here, they didn't include liens in the original estimate. And when we don't include liens, we get more individuals that'll be eligible. We also get almost 4 times the cost of the program. So the third part of our project was to develop a tool for the community members to be able to advertise the program to possible eligible community members, homeowners, and also advertise property tax appreciation that we estimate on this. So this is where we're at right now. Big part of this is trying to validate our income estimates, our tax appreciation estimates, and what we'd like to do is we'd like to use the community members who are going to be able to see this to also be able to update the information. So maybe next year they can update what their actual tax was or their income, et cetera. So we can validate these machine learning methods that we used to estimate income and tax appreciation. So it adds a little bit more community science and participation to it. So these are acknowledgments, and like I said, if you want to know more about the methods and stuff, we have a poster downstairs, and check out our paper. Thanks.
Okay. Well, hi. I'm Bernice Herman. I am a data scientist at the University of Washington eScience Institute. And we also host a data science for social good program 10 weeks in the summer. And this particular project is data science for urban equity. So it's myself, the data science lead, with some project leads and 4 students. So Seattle, where we focus this summer, is a large metro area and with lots of growth. 2 of the last 5 years voted the fastest growing big US city. And you see a lot of that growth due to the expanding tech industry, which not surprisingly means some inequitable prosperity across demographics and neighborhoods. So this summer, what we wanted to do have 2 outputs. One is an interactive visualization tool to see this inequity, and then the other is building an underlying structural equation model to start to analyze that inequity and predict. So let's get to equity and opportunity mapping, which is the current practice used by urban planners. So often what happens is you want to measure this opportunity, access to opportunity, or different resources across the city. And you'll see a map like this. And often you will see either a single variable or a small group of variables, 3 to 7, equally weighted. And you often see it at a city level, while you see interventions or different actions may look at a neighborhood scale. We wanted to build a tool to help urban planners do something similar to this, but maybe more access into the neighborhood scale and adding some statistical rigor. So this is some slide shots from our demo. So you see a list of variables to the left, mostly census data and city open data. You see a distribution across the entire city with also the data. And you see it at a neighborhood level. We can see it at a census tract level. And then the lowest we have is a census block group level. So we can go one step further, which you don't see in a lot of other equity mapping, which is down into the neighborhood. We see the same projections onto the neighborhood, but also different information and built environment details. And then finally, we are demoing a kind of prediction tool that incorporates our model into this in an additional way to help urban planners predict and use our model more thoroughly. So equity mapping is pretty popular and used by the majority. Why would we go further and create a statistical model? Most people actually do, and they don't realize it. When you're combining multiple variables, you're creating a statistical model. It just happens to be equally weighted across maybe a small number of variables. The other thing you could do is maybe predict equity or have some kind of scenario analysis. What if this neighborhood had a large influx of people or housing prices or Starbucks? Our model in particular, our structural equation model, can help us think about the correlation between these data sets, collapse these data sets into interpretable themes, and facilitate applied research into the mechanisms of inequity and gentrification. So we can start to think about what's actually causing things. And we'll go a little further into that. So first, this is a view of what we normally see, the indexing method. So I have 5 variables here. They are somehow put into one latent variable, which I'm calling urban equity here. It might be risks of gentrification. And they're often equally weighted and handpicked. But I can overrepresent things, like I have obesity rates and physical activity rates, which are related. Our structural equation model, we take those same data sets, probably add others that are very similar, and we're now projecting onto these latent variables that we couldn't measure, like health, development, socioeconomic well-being, and finding measurement risk between these different variables. And we can go one step further and now see the relationships between these themes that we can never really measure, in addition to some larger variable, maybe urban equity, to get some more analysis there. So this is our initial results. We actually find that we don't have a central urban equity, which isn't surprising. There's no mechanism for urban equity. But we do see these 8 themes emerge just from the statistical correlations and how they relate to one another. Knowing how these things relate allow you to do further analysis into how elementary school well-being and family-friendly housing and public health alter equity in these different neighborhoods. Our next steps are a private beta for our website, so to select people, and then also enhancements to the model. And I want to thank a large group of people, especially the University of Washington eScience Institute and our funders, and Urban at UW, and the rest of the team. Thank you.